Welcome, everyone, to this morning's first plenary session on working together to reform factory farming. My name is David Casuto. I'm a professor of law at Pace Law School. I also have the privilege of serving on the board of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And it is a great honor for me to be up here with these distinguished panelists to talk about one of the most urgent and important issues of animal and environmental law before us today. We're going to be discussing concentrated animal feeding operations, which are known by the acronym CAFOs, and their impact on the animals raised in those CAFOs, as well as the impact on the environment, human health, and on the workers who toil in those facilities. CAFOs raise all kinds of issues for all of the stakeholders in that business, in that industry. And I often say when I teach animal law that all law is animal law, and particularly environmental law. Environmental law is how I came to animal law, and CAFOs really are the poster child for the intersection of animal and environmental law, but they are also implicate human rights law and all kinds of social issues as well. So we're going to be exploring all those aspects of the CAFO issue, and we are very lucky to have with us panelists who are expert in those areas. And we're going to begin with a 5-minute overview of the problems from each of those perspectives from the panelists, and then we're going to turn it into sort of a roundtable discussion, and then we're going to open it up to you all to participate as well. So I'm going to just introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to jump back and let them do their thing. Our first speaker is Joyce Tishler, who is the co-founder and general counsel of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. She has been doing this for a long time, for as long as there's been animal law. That's a good thing, Joy. I mean, you know. and she was also the first CEO of the ALDF. She's taught the first farmed animal law and policy course, and she's currently at work, because she never stops, co-editing a book on farmed animal issues. So she's going to address the issue of the impact of CAFOs on animals. Our next speaker will be Deborah Sivas, who is the Luke W. Cole Professor of Environmental Law and Director of the Environmental Clinic here at Stanford Law School. She's a very accomplished lawyer in the environmental law realm, and as it also bleeds over into the animal area, she has, among other things, successfully challenged the George W. Bush administration's so-called mileage standards, and I put that in quotes, for light trucks. And she also held the EPA accountable for invasive species in ballast water. So she's, as I say, environmental law is most assuredly animal law, and Professor Sivas is walking, talking proof of that. Our next panelist is Jen Sorensen, who is an attorney with the National Resource Defense Council's litigation team in San Francisco. She represents plaintiffs in a suit at the moment against the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to restrict the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics in livestock production. She's also worked on actions to abate water and groundwater pollution and to defend California's low-carbon fuel standard from industry attack. She's been doing all kinds of important animal and environmental work for quite a while, and it's great to have her here. Our next speaker will be Professor Kathleen Hessler, who is professor of law at Lewis & Clark and director of the only animal law clinic in the country. She's also the first faculty member to teach animal law full-time at a law school. She's been working on behalf of animals since the 1980s, and she is the faculty advisor to SALDIF up at Lewis & Clark. She is advisor to the Animal Law Review. She coaches the Animal Law Moot Court team. She's the author of many articles, and she's the co-author of Animal Law in a Nutshell. So one could go on and on about all of these panelists, but rather than do that, why don't we hear from them? So I'll turn this over to Joyce Tishler.
Good morning. Nothing like starting us off with what Carol Adams calls traumatic knowledge on a Saturday morning. I'm going to spend 5 minutes on the conditions in which animals are raised in CAFOs and in intensive confinement. CAFOs, as David said, are industrial facilities where animals are kept in very small cages in large numbers. They have no access to sunlight, fresh air, no ability to exhibit natural behaviors, what David has called deliberate indifference to life. I really liked that comment. So they are treated as we would treat pencils in a drawer until they're ready to be sent to slaughter. This is what a CAFO looks like in general. It's a series of buildings and lagoons, and those lagoons contain manure and urine. They're massive, 20 million gallon lagoons. Pigs. Female pigs are called sows. They're bred to produce piglets over and over and over again, and the piglets are then raised to become the pork that people eat. Sows and CAFOs are housed in these, what I call containers, cages that have bars on the side and concrete on the bottom. These cages are so small that the sows cannot even turn around or walk for life. They have only enough room to stand up and lie down. There's no straw, no bedding. They suffer from sores, lameness. They urinate and defecate where they stand, and the waste falls through the floor into pits below them. They're breathing massive amounts of ammonia from their own waste, which leads to respiratory problems. These are intelligent animals who are bored and frustrated by any lack of activity. They develop coping behaviors such as bar chewing and sham chewing, which is just chewing just to keep their minds active. When a sow is no longer deemed productive, she's sent to slaughter. The piglets, around 100 million per year, are taken away from the sows within about 3 weeks. They are sent to these facilities where they are raised. They spend their entire very short lives in crowded pens, unable to exhibit natural behaviors. The natural lifespan of a pig is somewhere between 9 to 16 years old, 16 years rather. These pigs reach market weight, 250 pounds, at 6 months, and that's their whole life. They are sent to slaughter. Like most CAFO animals, they are mutilated in order to adapt them to this unnatural setting. And so their tails are cut off without anesthesia or painkiller. Chickens are amongst the most intensely confined beings. They are used to produce eggs, these chickens. They are confined in wire battery cages inside massive warehouses. They don't have enough room to stretch their wings or their legs. They have no privacy. There's no place to roost. And again, they cannot engage in any normal behavior. They are debeaked, and this is done to reduce the injuries that they cause to each other because of these crowded conditions. The debeaking is a painful process in which a knife cuts through bone and cartilage and soft tissue. These birds have been selectively bred so that each one lays more than 250 eggs a year. That takes its toll on the bird's body. After 1 year of production, they are sent to slaughter, although the natural lifespan of a chicken can be 8 to 10 years or longer. The male chicks that come from these chickens can't lay eggs, therefore they are disposed of as waste within a day or so after they hatch. Cheapest possible method is used, certainly not with any regard to their well-being. Chickens who are raised for meat are called broilers by the industry. Now, they've been bred so that they reach full market weight within 7 weeks, which is an extraordinarily fast period of growth. It causes painful leg problems and heart disorders. They're housed in crowded conditions, which again thwart any natural behaviors. Each chicken has less than 1 square foot of space. And they're living in their own waste. The waste isn't cleaned out until the 7-week cycle is over and they've been sent to slaughter. Dairy cows have also been bred so that today they're producing massive amounts of milk, far more than they would produce naturally, about 100 pounds of milk per day. Now, dairy cows, like any other mammal, only produce milk when they've had offspring, and so these cows are kept in a constant cycle of pregnancy, giving birth, and then being re-impregnated. The calves are immediately taken away, and these cows, because of the intense confinement, because of what's being asked of them or demanded of them, suffer from a variety of ailments. Constant pregnancy and childbirth produce bone deficiencies, mastitis, lameness, and while the natural lifespan of a cow could be 20 to 25 years, because there's such intense pressure on these animals, in 3 to 4 years, their bodies have worn out and they are sent to slaughter to be made into hamburger. Because of the poor condition that they're in, this is where you hear about downed animals. Beef cattle actually are raised in pasture for the most part still, until they are sent to feedlots for the last few months to be fed grains and fattened and sent to slaughter. They are dehorned, they are branded and castrated without anesthesia or pain relief. There are no federal laws, zero, that protect animals while they're being raised. The Federal Animal Welfare Act does not apply. The 28-hour law, which applies to transport, does not apply to the raising of animals. The Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act does not apply. That only applies to animals going through slaughter. And reminder is that 95% of animals going through slaughter are poultry, and they're not covered by the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act. The majority of state anti-cruelty laws contain exemptions for farmed animals or for the common practices such as debeaking, dehorning, branding, the intensive confinement. All of that is exempted from state anti-cruelty laws. However, since 2000, some states have banned particular practices, and rather than go through them, I'll just show you the list. CAFOs are the most significant animal welfare issue of our time, and yet most Americans have no idea they even exist. They think animals are still on farms the way they used to be. The Pew Commission has stated that this is an unacceptable level of risk, and it's an unsustainable system. Thank you. Our guy. Okay. How do we do it? Come, techie person. Stay close because we're only doing 5 minutes apiece at this point. Yes, thanks.
Good morning and welcome to Stanford. I want to give everyone a great big warm welcome from the Stanford faculty here. We're really proud to host the conference here this year, and it's a great turnout. And we ordered up a great day for you, so hopefully you'll learn a lot this weekend and also get a chance to spend some time walking around the campus. So I'm going to talk briefly about the environmental impacts from factory farms. I am not a huge PowerPoint user, but I couldn't resist in this context because the pictures are so graphic. So what's the big environmental problem? Well, as Joyce said, we have these huge CAFOs that generate massive amounts of animal manure from cattle, pigs, chicken, and turkeys. And the estimates are, I don't think there are really good estimates for how much total waste is produced, but a recent EPA estimate put it at 1.2 billion tons of manure per year, which is something like 10 times what the human populations produce in the United States. So that's a lot of poop to deal with. Okay, and just to give you a sense, this is a CAFO, the kind of scale we're talking about. These are very massive operations, often with many waste piles, lagoons, in addition to where the animals are being raised. Just to give an example of the scale for dairy cow production, from 1997 to 2002, the total number of dairy cattle being raised remained roughly about the same, but the number of farms decreased by nearly half. So that tells you something about the concentration. So we're moving into these huge factory farm situations. This is just another graphic that shows you the same effect with hogs, where you've got a relatively stable number of sows being born and raised, and yet the number of total farms is actually going down quite substantially. And on this graph, you can see that you now have a lot of operations that are more than 5,000 animals and growing. Okay, so what's the problem with manure? Well, it's full of all kinds of bad stuff, including one of the most pervasive is nutrients, so that's primarily nitrogen and phosphorus. Nutrients sounds kind of like, nutrients, but as I'll talk about just a little bit more in a minute, when these contaminants actually get out into the environment, they wreak havoc with the ecological system. You've got pathogens of all kinds. You've got bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella, parasites like Cryptosporidium and Giardia. Some of you have probably been exposed and had the symptoms of those before. You have all kinds of viruses, rotavirus, hepatitis E virus, influenza. I think there's been more than 150 pathogens identified in livestock manure. And most of these, or a lot of these, pose a risk to human health. You have heavy metals, zinc, copper, arsenic, selenium, and a host of others added to the system through sometimes in the growth stimulants that are given to animals, or in the pesticides that are used, sprayed to keep the flies and things down. Those heavy metals don't just go away, they work their way through the animals into the environment. You have antibiotics being used, and Jen's going to talk much more about that, but those antibiotics, one figure I saw was 29 million pounds of antibiotics used in livestock in 2010. Those generally don't break down, but they move again through the animals into the environment. You have hormones of all kinds, growth hormones, estrogens, androgens, progestrogens, all of which get excreted out in urine, manure, and bile, and move into the ecological system, disrupting the balance. And then you've got stuff that volatilizes off the farms. So the ones that you probably have heard about or read about, hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, which have strong odor components and affect local communities, also are respiratory irritants. You've also got some of the key greenhouse gases, so methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, coming off of these large farms. So a lot of contaminants going both into the water and the air. So these are just a couple of pictures of the ways that this waste gets stored on a big CAFO through these. They slurry it, it's mixed with water, and often pumped into these storage ponds or lagoons. Just some more pictures because they're lovely. You might want to take your boat out on that lake. Or big waste piles if the manure is dried, these massive piles on the farms. Some of this waste is then sort of recycled in a way back onto the cropland. If these factories are still growing their own feed for animals, they try to use this on the land, and that seems kind of good recycling, because what's in it is the nitrogen and the phosphorus, which is the constituents of fertilizer. But huge problems with the amount that they're using. way overusing it so that a lot of it runs off into nearby waterways, and on these large farms, they have more manure than they can apply to land. So Joyce already showed you this picture. I guess we both like this picture because it really shows you the cycle from the confined areas into the lagoons, into a basin where they try to add oxygen to break down some of the components into another lagoon. So it's a massive waste handling system here. And this is just a quick graphic of the different ways that the constituents can get into the environment. You have runoff over the land, a lot of soil and contaminants running off into surface waters, also filtering down into groundwater. You've got these lagoons which are supposed to confine the waste, but often in rain events overflow into the nearby waterways. So here's an example of one on the left here where you can see the squares that are the ponds, but after a rain event, whole thing has just flushed into the nearby wetlands. So it's a lovely brown color. So nitrogen from these overflowing farms and from infiltration and runoff is a huge problem in this country. This map shows you, the map on the upper right shows you the intensity of nitrogen use today as a fraction of pre-European nitrogen in the ambient environment. And you can see it's very concentrated in the Midwest where a lot of the CAFO activity goes on. The result of this is, and it's not just, I mean, to be fair, it's CAFOs and other kinds of agriculture, but the result of all this is moving these nutrients down through the Mississippi River system into the Gulf of Mexico, where there's a huge dead zone and a growing dead zone over time as a result of too much nitrogens getting into the water. And so what you see both in the waterways, inland waterways, and sometimes on the coast is these huge fish die-offs as the aquatic species are deprived of oxygen. The nitrogen causes algal blooms that then breed bacteria that eat up all the oxygen, not enough oxygen for the organisms that live there. So that's a huge issue. I was gonna, I think one of the biggest, or maybe the biggest, CAFO spill in history occurred in North Carolina in 1995, where 120,000 square foot lagoon ruptured, I think, in a storm event and released 25.8 million gallons of waste into the New River. And the spill killed 10 million fish and sickened the local population with respiratory problems and other things. So you do have these massive events happening. In addition to the nutrients coming off, there's all kinds of contaminants that we saw in the manure that go into the ecosystem, disrupt reproductive cycles, affect the ecological balance. And then, again, resistant bacteria, those things are moving into the system. They're affecting aquatic and terrestrial wildlife the same way that they could be affecting us as human beings. Okay, so just to quickly run through, this is groundwater at risk. You can see the same, I put this map up here just because you can see the same problem. It's concentrated Central Valley of California and the Midwest, where you've got a very high groundwater risk. This groundwater contamination implicates human populations as well, is a huge environmental justice concern. I've worked on it here in California. These are a couple of photographs of folks that we've met with down in the Salinas Valley of California, which is another growing area out by the coast, where water was their drinking water, local, rural drinking water. That's all they've got. They don't have big municipal systems. Saw it contaminated with nitrates at twice the EPA drinking water standards. These folks had to go get bottled water. They had sores on their bodies. And ultimately, it's also an economic problem. They've had to spend millions of dollars to try to clean up their water system and get acceptable drinking water. Okay, and then one last map. The air pollution, you see the same pattern again. This is a map of ammonia, atmospheric ammonia, where again, it's very concentrated and large amount of the atmospheric ammonia is caused by emissions at CAFOs. All right, and the human toll from the atmospheric emissions is also growing in the rural areas where recent studies have shown that asthma and other respiratory problems are increasing around areas where CAFOs exist. So just very quickly, we're going to hopefully talk more about this as we go forward with the panel, but what are the legal handles? The big one is the Clean Water Act. For those of you who are familiar with the Clean Water Act, it's a slow and very cumbersome mechanism. EPA has slowly tried to ratchet up restrictions on water discharges from CAFOs to not to great effect in my mind. The industry has repeatedly challenged and successfully in many cases. And so you have a set of rules on the books, but they're less than totally effective, in part because the Clean Water Act contains an exemption for agricultural stormwater discharges, and EPA has been trying for years to figure out how that interfaces with trying to regulate CAFOs, and I think we can talk more about it. It's not very good. So stormwater is when you've got rain events coming onto a field or onto a confinement facility or onto a manure pond and then running off. Generally, that stuff would be exempt. In what situations is it not exempt? That's the struggle that EPA and a lot of environmental practitioners are trying to get at. How do we put some more teeth into that and not just have everything exempted? There are a lot of problems with the Clean Water Act. For those of you who've come up against it, there are, first of all, a pretty high threshold for what's a CAFO under the definition that EPA has in place. There is no duty to apply for a permit, so a lot of the legwork would fall on those folks trying to challenge a CAFO for not having a water discharge permit. Clean Water Act does not protect groundwater. It's a surface water law. EPA's regulations continue to allow these massive lagoons and the spraying of contaminated waste onto nearby cropland. Most of the Clean Water Act program is delegated down to the states. It's very uneven permitting, and you can imagine some of the states where the biggest CAFOs are and that cater to CAFOs have the weakest state laws. So that's a problem there. And the other thing is just in terms of trying to enforce these laws, EPA in the states, neither of them have a lot of enforcement money. A lot of it falls to citizens trying to do it, and those are difficult cases we can talk more about. Just quickly, legal handles on the air side, there aren't really any. There is the Clean Air Act, and but the pollutants that come off of CAFOs are not currently regulated under the Clean Air Act. Some groups are trying to get EPA to regulate ammonia as an air emission, but to date that hasn't happened. Okay, and just to close here, so a lot of folks are trying to turn to common law, the old common law stuff that we all know, negligence, nuisance, trespass, for some of these environmental incursions. Lots of hurdles there. But people are turning back to those because the federal regulatory structure is not great in terms of trying to reduce these impacts. So hopefully we can talk some more about this. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen Sorensen, and I'm going to talk about antibiotic use in livestock production, which is the subject of a lawsuit that I've been litigating for the past 2 years. So most of you have probably heard about the problem of antibiotic resistance. Antibiotics save lives, but the more we use them, the less effective they become because bacteria develop resistance to them. And at the same time that antibiotics are becoming less effective, the pipeline for new antibiotic drugs is slowing down. I talked to a microbiologist who works on this, and he explained to me that there's only a limited number of mechanisms that work against bacteria. So when we run out of the antibiotics we have, we'll have lost a vital tool for fighting disease. That means we need to protect the drugs we have by limiting their use. And of course, factory farms are doing anything but that. Only 20% of all antibiotics sold in the United States go to humans. The vast majority, 80%, go to livestock. And of all of the drugs used on livestock, the lion's share, 86%, are used on animals that are not sick. Ever since the 1950s, livestock producers have been routinely adding low doses of antibiotics to animal feed to make animals grow faster and to compensate for the crowded and unsanitary conditions in factory farms. So our CAFOs are producing not only vast quantities of meat, but also vast quantities of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And that's a huge problem because the bacteria don't stay on the farm. They're carried off in animal waste that contaminates soil and water, on farm workers and food processors, and on contaminated meat products that reach consumers. And not only do the bacteria themselves travel, but they can also share their genes with other bacteria. So bacteria that don't make people sick can share the resistance they've developed with bacteria that do make people sick. I talked, again, talking to the same microbiologist, he told me that once we discover more about how bacterial genes travel, he thinks we'll find out that a lot of hospital-acquired antibiotic-resistant infections actually originated in factory farms. And this slide shows that a lot of retail meat products, such as chicken breast, are frequently contaminated with antibiotic-resistant bacteria like Campylobacter, E. coli, Salmonella. There's consensus in the scientific, medical, and public health communities that this is a growing crisis. But the US Food and Drug Administration, which regulates antibiotic use in livestock, has done very little to address the problem. And that's where our lawsuit comes in. Researching this issue back in 2011, I discovered that FDA itself had made findings all the way back in 1977 that the use of two particular antibiotics in animal feed, penicillin and tetracyclines, was, quote, not shown to be safe for human health. And FDA's governing statute says that once the agency makes that finding, it's required to hold a hearing. And unless the drug manufacturers can prove that those drug uses are safe, then the agency is required to withdraw its approval of those drug uses. So here, FDA had made the findings that should have triggered that administrative process back in 1977, but in 35 years, it had never held that required hearing. In the meantime, citizen groups had petitioned FDA to withdraw approval of several additional important antibiotics that are used in animal feed, and FDA had never even responded to the petitions. They'd been sitting out there for 12 years and 6 years. So we filed suit against FDA. In response to our lawsuit, FDA did two things. First, it withdrew the notice that it had published back in 1977 that contained the findings that the penicillin and tetracyclines were not shown to be safe. The agency didn't say that it had changed its mind about the science, and it couldn't have said that because the agency's recent statements on antibiotic resistance just reinforced the original findings. But instead, it said that it had decided to ask drug manufacturers voluntarily to take these drug products off of the market. So rather than do the job that federal law requires it to do, FDA was asking the industry to police itself. The other thing FDA did was deny the citizen petitions without even mentioning the science showing that the drugs were not shown to be safe. And again, it said it was following a voluntary approach. Fortunately, the federal district court in New York saw things our way. It ordered FDA to withdraw its approval of penicillin and tetracyclines in animal feed. Those were the drugs that had been found not to be shown safe in 1977, unless the drug manufacturers can prove in a hearing that those uses are safe. It also held that FDA violated the law when it denied the citizen petitions, because in deciding to follow the voluntary approach, FDA was just dodging the question of whether the drug uses are safe. And of course, if the agency finds that they're not safe, it has to take mandatory action. It can't just rely on a voluntary approach. I wish I could say that that was the end of the matter, but FDA has appealed both decisions to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, so we have to wait and see whether that court agrees that FDA has to move forward to end antibiotic use in livestock production. And meanwhile, federal inaction on antibiotic use in livestock continues, as this cartoon from Thursday's Washington Post illustrates, and thanks to Joyce for sending this to me. I'd be happy to answer any questions later on.
Good morning. While we get things set up, I just want to say that there are lots of chairs up front for the folks sitting and standing in the back. If you want to come forward, please do. If you're comfortable, that's also fine. Thanks. So good morning. I'm happy to be with you all. I'm Kathy Hessler, and I'm here to talk about the risks to workers in this system. So in all systems, this system, like all systems that are predicated on violence, the victims of those systems are broader than may first appear. And so this is something I'm really happy that we get a chance to talk about today, because we don't always talk about this in our community. So I've titled this slide Old versus New. It's not really old versus new. There are all kinds of systems of production that are in practice at the same time. But the industrialization is what we're here to talk about primarily. All of the things that I'm going to talk about and that others are going to talk about apply, maybe not equally, but apply in the sort of sustainable farming communities as well as in the commodified communities. So I'm going to break this down in thinking about the problems workers face in a couple of different subcategories and then talk about some of the larger issues really quickly. So if in working with birds, so $45 billion industry, 500,000 workers. So in the slaughter facility, those workers are required to process up to 140 birds per minute. Per minute. So that means every motion they have to do 140 times within a minute, and that's likely to go up to 175 per minute if the current regs go forward. So lots and lots of injuries, lots and lots of problems that they face. And one thing in particular I'd like to draw your attention to, even when they have access to some protective gear, as you'll see at the bottom of the slide, only small percentages of facilities provide these, and smaller percentages provide them at no cost. So the workers have to pay for their own protective gear when the facility already knows these are dangerous conditions. So pigs. Pigs face a lot of difficulties, and the people working with them face a lot of difficulties. The numbers for the rates of injury in each of these subcategories is different, as you'll know, and then there are overall industry injury rates and fatality rates. So, and it also, within each subcategory, it depends on what kind of injury we're talking about how prevalent it is among workers in that industry. So 70% of all workers have respiratory irritation or illness. 70%. Okay, that's a pretty staggering number that we design systems where we know that's the outcome, and all kinds of significant issues. One thing that I often didn't think about was the noise. So noise creates physiological and other problems, lasting problems for people. The situation working with cows. We've already talked a little bit about ammonia, and just one statistic. So 6 parts per million is what's allowed, or what causes problems, allowed before it causes problems. OSHA allows up to 50 parts per million, right, in these facilities. And in these facilities, in the slaughter facilities, the workers process 400 cows per hour. Right, and I'm saying process because it's early in the morning. I don't want to talk about the graphics, but you know what we're talking about. So the repetitive motion injuries are pretty high in all of these. I want to just broaden our thinking about what kinds of work the folks that we're talking about engage in and what kinds of harms they're subject to. So broadening our concept of the risk that they face. So workers are creating food for the animals to eat before the animals are turned into food for humans, and there's harms in that context. They're working on ranches and breeding facilities, factory farms, slaughter facilities, transportation, and other related contexts. People creating pesticides that go into the production in GMO labs, and all of those settings have their own particularized kinds of risks. And the kinds of harm that come from those settings, I also want to broaden our thinking about. So we know about the repetitive motion injuries. We know about the physical injuries, cuts. People have broken bones. People are in contact, especially working with cows and pigs, with really large animals who are obviously scared and not happy, right? And they get kicked and they get cut and they get significant injuries. We know a little bit about farm injuries, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, but it's really important. So the conversation we're going to have today is really about on the farm, but I do want to bring some of these other contexts to your mind. We know about silo injuries and tractor injuries. We've talked a little bit about the antibiotic resistance. There is one study that measured antibiotic resistance present in workers who work on farms where there's antibiotic use and farms where there isn't. And it wasn't present for workers in the farms where antibiotics weren't used. Surprising. Not really, right? But it's nice to prove the point that we're creating these problems, and we know the solutions, therefore, right? We know what to do to fix these problems. Additionally, workers are at risk for zoonotic diseases, the transfer of diseases to and from animals. Youth injuries and senior citizen injuries, the more I look at this, the more shocking it becomes to me how those particularly vulnerable categories of folks are not protected. And I'll talk a moment later about the youth injuries in particular. Economic instability. Most of the workers at this point are not people who own these facilities, right, or their families. These are becoming increasingly contract workers. They're not even considered full-time employees, so they don't have unemployment benefits, they don't have medical insurance, health benefits. They really have very little protection, and they can be fired and they can be bullied into doing all kinds of work very easily. Language barriers. More people than you might realize who are working in these industries do not have English as a first language, and most of the safety regulations, in the facilities are written in English. Most of the manuals are in English, even though increasingly that's not supposed to be the case. Immigration status, many are at risk because of their immigration status, and it's something we need to think about, and they've been exploited because of that. And psychological. There are some studies that indicate that workers in these facilities and in these conditions where they're exposed to a lot of violence often replicate that violence in their human communities. So something for us to think about. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's quite a lot. I simply want to point out this is OSHA's own findings. And this is just in the farm context, right? So this is what they say are the problems. They also point out age is a problem, equipment, lack of protective equipment, and lack of medical care, right? So we're talking about people who work in remote areas. You saw the pictures of those CAFOs, right? There's no hospitals right nearby, most of those. So there's very little medical assistance at the facility, and they have to go quite a distance to get significant medical assistance. So agriculture is among the most dangerous industries in the United States and has been for quite a long time. These are just a couple of statistics that indicate that. So in 2011, 570 agricultural workers died. So we're not talking about minor injuries, and we're not talking about this being unusual this particular year. The statistics are pretty overwhelming. So overall in the industry, and the industry does not define the risk categories as broadly as I do, or the context as broadly as I do. So just within the narrow context, the injury rate is over 40% higher than for all other industries. Grain entrapments. One of the things I just want to point out, so this is actually where people go into silos and fall into the silos and can't get out, right? There's also manure lagoon entrapments. There's all kinds of other slides I could show you. My point here is just to show you that there are fatal and non-fatal, and that both are on the rise, and it's something we should be very concerned about. Age-related. It's pretty stunning to see how many underage people are working in the industry. There are a lot of folks saying, well, this is a family farm and my kids need to work on the farm, and that's actually the minority of situations when young people are working on the farm. I thought this particular case was stunning because in 2008, there were 57 underage workers, some as young as 15 years old, were working in a meat packing plant. And that same company had been charged 2 years earlier with 9,311 child labor violations. We're not talking about insignificant, right, instances of harm or violations of what few laws we actually have. And we know about this, and we're not doing enough to take care of it. So young people in particular are very vulnerable and very exploited. This is the age distribution for a number of incidents. And so you'll see, it's pretty sad to me that there is this is really why I'm showing you the slide, that there are categories for youth workers that go from 1 to 15. There shouldn't be a category, right, for youth worker that young. And frankly, from 80 to 89, right, it's pretty stunning. So this is, now I have to say this slide doesn't tell you how many of these folks are working in the industry. And so this is not a relative slide. So these are absolute numbers of incidents, which is why I think the middle categories are higher, because there are more people in those categories working. But it's pretty outrageous. OSHA has their own information about risks to youth workers, including cancer, right? So again, we're talking about serious diseases, long-term impacts that we know about and we're not protecting people from. Legal protections. Not a lot, right? We don't have a lot of protections. There are some. So OSHA has its own sort of scheme of protections for agriculture and general industry protections. They have things called the General Duty Clause. There are specific things like field sanitation and rollover protection that's for tractors. And there are a few more specific ones that we can talk about later if people are interested in. States also have some of their own standards, and luckily they can exceed OSHA standards, the federal standards. Some states have just adopted the federal standards. OSHA does have a foreign language requirement, and some states have that as well, so that's important, and unfortunately very little, poorly enforced, I should say. Limitations. So for the workers in these categories, right, wage issues, whether they're classified as an independent contractor or an employee, increasingly most of them are independent contractors, so fewer duties, fewer legal obligations are owed to them. So as I said, no health insurance, unemployment, no security, no job security. We're not even talking about Social Security. The line speeds are punishing, the work is hard. There's inadequate reporting. So all of the statistics I found, they really vary in some wide regard. There's consensus there's no accurate reporting, right? OSHA even has recognized that farms aren't reporting properly. And they find these things out when someone like dies, right? Or gets in the news. And like, gosh, and by the way, you didn't report that even after it was in the news. The healthcare problems, there are actual threats that workers are facing if they report any of the things they see or if they try to protect themselves. There's been significant union busting, including with facilities having armed guards on facilities. And there are some explicit exemptions for the agricultural industry for OSHA, EPA, and other regulations. One thing I want to say, just to end, is that, as Albert Einstein said, we can't solve the problems that we have by using the same kind of thinking we use to create them. So we're now going to talk about new ways of thinking. Thank you.
All right, so now we move on to our lightning round, where we throw some topics out for the panel to discuss. And I think we can, you know how sometimes people, when they have a picture taken of themselves, they say, make sure you take it of my good side. I think we can probably all agree that CAFOs don't have a good side. So now we're gonna, the first question I have for the panel is, so now what happens? Can CAFOs be driven out of business, or are we looking for reform, or what are our goals here? Joyce, you want to start us off?
Obviously, as you've heard, CAFOs create a lot of harm to a lot of different stakeholders. Why do CAFOs exist? Well, they didn't always exist. They started in the 1930s and 40s with chickens and then really caught on in the 50s. And the 50s mentality of technology will solve everything if we can just industrialize. What?
The mics are very
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not. Okay, there. That's better. Okay. This 1950s technology solves everything kind of attitude is partly what brought about CAFOs. And I want to make that point because they didn't exist, in the good old, well, there were never good old days, but they haven't existed for that long. They're an invention of the 20th century, and I think, yes, they can be eliminated. And the reason for that is we've got two major reports that came out in 2008, the Pew Commission report, which I showed a snippet of, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, both really respected agencies or organizations, which have said this is unsustainable, and it's unsustainable because it's harming the environment to a point where we simply can't deal with this anymore, and it's harming human beings. And as we're learning more and more about the antibiotic problem, I think that's going to appeal to consumers, and consumers, as I think we will be discussing, really are a key to changing this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we have economic forces at work, so it's always hard and challenging as someone who's worked in the trenches in the environmental field for a few decades now. Your progress is slow, but I do think a combination, and I'll love to hear more what Jen has to say, because I think the antibiotic thing is a real issue. People understand that issue at a very visceral level, that we could be causing long-term human population impacts by what we're doing here. I would just say on the environmental front, I think there is a growing awareness in the communities, the rural communities where these facilities are located, that they are impacting the community. Often part of the problem in trying to push something out is that it is an economic generator for the local communities. But here, you're reading more and more accounts of local people affected by odor and respiratory problems, and seeing fish die-offs in the local waters and having contaminated drinking water. And so that's a movement that's pushing. I think it's going to be a lot of forces. So it's the consumer side, it's the antibiotics issue, and probably some of the environmental issues too. So whether we can eliminate them, I don't know. Maybe I'm a little less optimistic than Joyce, but I think there are lots of different fronts to be taking them on. And part of, I think, what this panel is, how do we bring our various constituents together to have a united front on this?
Yeah, I should say that the goal of the NRDC antibiotics campaign is focused on changing practices at CAFOs and not necessarily eliminating CAFOs per se. But if we can remove non-therapeutic antibiotics from CAFOs, that will have obviously a huge health benefit for humans and animals, in that it will help us preserve antibiotics for medical treatment, but it will also probably require, some big changes at factory farms. The reason we know that is because other countries have done this. One of the examples we always point to is Denmark, which has an industrial animal production system similar to the United States. They stopped using non-therapeutic antibiotics in the late 1990s. And the World Health Organization went in and did a study to find out, how effective that ban had been and what the impact had been on factory farms. And what they found was that initially, when they looked specifically at pork production. Initially, when the pork producers stopped using non-therapeutic antibiotics and didn't change anything else, they just had more animals dying on the farm because they still had these, terrible conditions, and the animals were getting sick. And also the use of therapeutic antibiotics went up. So they realized they needed to make some changes, and they did 4 main things, one of which they started weaning piglets later, letting them stay with their mothers longer. They also increased the amount of space per animal. They improved the ventilation in the factory farms, and they increased the frequency of the cleaning of the bedding and the other materials in the farm. And with those changes, by improving the welfare for the animals, they were able to remove the non-therapeutic antibiotics without seeing increased mortality in the animals. They still do have, large farms, which would probably meet the definition of factory farms, but the conditions are significantly improved to allow for the removal of non-therapeutic antibiotics. So that's something that we would hope to see if we were able to remove non-therapeutic antibiotics here in the United States.
Yeah, I think that one of the benefits of science is that it can self-correct. And so science got us into this difficulty a little bit, but it can help us get out as well. And I mean that from a couple of different perspectives. So one is that we now have an awful lot more scientific evidence about the capacities of animals and who they are as beings. And as that becomes more mainstream and more recognized, both within the scientific communities as well as the larger communities, I think that even the more well-managed large facilities will come under question as a means of operation. I think that that's something that we can focus on, and I think we can help encourage getting that information out. I don't think CAFOs are going anywhere anytime soon, but I also think they're going to collapse under their own weight. I think the fact that there are so many stakeholder communities just that we're representing to talk about today, and it has CAFOs have negative impact on all of them, right? All of them. The only folks that CAFOs are really good for are the owners, right? That's it. And so far that works pretty well for them, and in our system that works pretty well, and that can be maintained for a while, but not forever. So I think when you have workers and people in the community who are losing value for their lands and can't go outside and enjoy their backyards because of the flies and the manure, and they're getting sick and they have to move and they can't get any value for their houses, when you have people who are getting sick from the products that are produced from these facilities, when you have people who are getting sick just because they breathe the air from these facilities, when you have air pollution, water pollution, groundwater pollution, soil pollution, when you have destruction of the soil, right, that is because of the crop production going into feeding these animals. We have so many problems that are related to CAFOs. I think that eventually we're going to reach a consensus in society where if we have one problem we can agree on solving, that's going to have a large impact on the world, on everything we do, everything from eating, breathing, right, water production, it will be reducing and eventually ending CAFOs. So that's the long term. But I think the fact that you all are here and that we're here and we're talking about these from larger perspectives and beginning to think about how to work together on this, both from consumer level, legal level, social policy, that makes me hopeful.
One of the things that at least I think is somewhat of a cause for optimism with respect to CAFO issues is that there is not a real controversy here. It's not as if when someone hears, oh, animals are brutalized, the environment is being horribly degraded, we're increasing antibiotic resistance, and workers are laboring under horrible conditions, you will hardly ever hear anyone say, booyah, I'm for that. Right? So what we have is a problem that most people can agree is in need of solving. People may differ on the nature of the solution, but the problem itself, once people learn of it, tends to be something that people can get behind resolving. So that leads to the next question, which is, why don't people know more about this? Why isn't this a cause for alarm, national, international alarm? And so that raises an issue of transparency then. And so my question for the panel, and maybe we'll come back from the dealers right on this one, is how does a lack of transparency affect the issues that each of you is working on, and what can be done to improve that situation?
Yeah, and I think I would also add to what you just said, David, to say that we're in a new place now because people are agreeing there's a problem, right? That's a huge step. So 10 years ago when we had this conversation, people would have denied these facts. They would have just said, you're exaggerating. It can't be that bad. That's not right. Farmers wouldn't do that to the environment. People won't treat their workers that way, right? The facts, not only were they not known, they would have been denied and they would have been disputed. That is decreasing. And so as David suggests, once people know this is the reality, then we can have a conversation. So how do we get them to know this is the reality? So one measure, we were talking actually earlier before we started this panel, about how do we know where we're going in success rates and sort of to be hopeful. And so for me, one measure of hope are the awful ag-gag laws that people will talk about later in the conference. That to me is a signal that the industry is sufficiently concerned about what happens when people find out what's going on in these facilities that they want to shut down the flow of that information. And so as bad as that is, it's also an indication that we're making some progress because it does have effect. So how can we get more transparency? Well, clearly we can keep working against the ag-gag laws, right? So all 11 this past year were defeated, yay. And so I think we're actually in a good trend for that, and lots of people will keep up the struggle for that. I think we need to talk more across our communities. I think one of the things that has happened and it happens with all of us, we get focused on our own particular issues. And it takes an awful lot just to get that information out and to educate ourselves within our own area. And so we get a little siloed information-wise, right? So lots of folks in the animal community, it took us a while to begin thinking about the environmental consequences and then the worker consequences, right? And so beginning to think about what our areas of interest are and how we can build community and we can reach out to people with similar interests. I also want to say sometimes there are folks who aren't as comfortable working across community, because if you're going to work with a farmer who's doing it better, right, that's not something everyone in our community would be comfortable with. And so we have to figure out how to have conversations with people we may not agree with on everything, but where there is agreement and where we can work together and move forward. And I think the more that we do that, the more we'll break down barriers. The transparency issues will become a little bit easier to address. But I think we have to actually ask for it, right? So we have to be doing the FOIA requests and the public records requests. We have to be pushing that data out there. We have to be fighting all the laws that are struggling to shut down whistleblowers, right? There's a lot of explicit legal policy that's happening right now to maintain the opaqueness. And those are things we have to work on explicitly as well, and share information in the communities to let people know this is happening, as well as working on the substantive issues.
In the antibiotics realm, a lot of groups have worked hard to shine a light on the huge misuse and overuse of antibiotics in livestock production, but we still don't know a lot about how those drugs are being used on the farms. This is information that the federal government has and will not make public. FDA is required by law to collect information on how these drugs are dispensed and what kinds of drugs and what amounts are used on factory farms. They only make the coarsest summary of that information available to the public because it's confidential business information to protect the practices of the farm operators. So that's how we know that 80% of all antibiotics used in the U.S. go to factory farms, but beyond that, we don't know a lot. Congresswoman Louise Slaughter has gotten some of that information through an information request to FDA, which is why we know a little bit more about how much of that use is non-therapeutic. But other than that, it's information that FDA has kept a tight lid on. So NRDC has filed a Freedom of Information Act request and sued FDA for failing to provide that information, and that's something that we're continuing to litigate. There's also bills in the House and Senate to request or to require FDA to make public more of the information that it has on antibiotic use. If we had this information, it would help us have a better idea of exactly how antibiotic resistance trends are moving from factory farms to the general public, and would help us make a stronger case for ending this practice. So it's information that we're trying hard to get.
I'll just quickly, I think, echo both Kathy and Jen's point on, I think one of the ways to really move the ball forward is to figure out how we build bridges between these different stakeholders in the process. And having worked in the environmental field for a long time, I know that often people are resistant to make common cause with some groups that they may not, may have been on the other side of the issue on other issues. And a really good example is, can we build coalitions to smaller farmers who are disadvantaged by the large factory farm system and the subsidies that go into all of that, and direct subsidies, and then subsidies in terms of external costs that those farms don't have to bear. But it's a tough slog getting environmentalists to sit down and talk to agricultural folks, right? But I really think that's we need to reach out and think about who are some new coalitions there to build. And I think it's true across from animal rights to environmental groups. Sometimes there's animosity there. And so that's just a key thing is finding out how to have those conversations and really broaden the base, because if you're representing farm workers or you're representing animal rights folks, it's just hard. Those are small worlds, and so we need to really build a broader campaign. just on the transparency issue, the information issue, I think that is a huge problem, and it's something that, you know, you can reach out and have community groups really step up and do. You don't need lawyers to do Public Record Act requests, FOIA requests. I mean, those are things that local folks can do, because I think often you have folks, well, what can I do? I'm not a lawyer. We don't have lawyers. We can't bring a lot of lawsuits. But just hammering away on the agencies that have this information and that in some places are not releasing it, and really trying to get the public light, you know, shed on that, and that's citizen activism and democracy at work. So
I think we have to, from an animal welfare perspective, really push the attitude that if you have nothing to hide, open your doors and show us what you're doing. Since 1998, animal activists have gotten into both slaughter facilities and CAFOs on at least 76 occasions, undercover investigations, and have found repeated violations of animal cruelty laws, if they would have been applied, and health and safety codes. And there have been, and this has caused food recalls, criminal indictments, convictions. It has had an impact on industry. Thus, we're seeing, as Kathy mentioned, the rise of efforts to pass ag-gag laws, and we'll talk about that later here. But I think that we can push and say, show us what you're doing. One thing that I think we should be pushing for, and are starting to, is video cameras, video surveillance in all CAFOs and slaughterhouses. This is something that Temple Grandin has requested and supports. If you have live camera feeds, it's going to encourage workers, obviously, to act better towards the animals because they're going to be on camera. One company actually rewards workers with pizza parties. They're using live feeds, and it goes to committees at that facility. I think we should be focusing, and at ALDF, we are heavily focusing on labeling and false advertising. We have a number of lawsuits. One lawsuit, Glover versus Mart, we went after what we thought was a relatively small facility, and as we went through the litigation, we found out they were a lot larger than we realized. Something called Judy's Eggs and some other labels in Sonoma County. They had been advertising on their cartons that, and implying that these chickens were free range and that they scratch in the grass in Sonoma County and have fresh air, when in fact these chickens were raised in enclosed barns in these big warehouses. They were not free-range chickens. They were cage-free, but not free-range. And so we do want to push on labeling these so that the consumer knows, were these chickens cage-free? Were they in cages? Were they in enriched cages? Or were they free-range? We need to teach consumers about what those differences are, and then effectively label those products so that consumers can make a choice. If they want to eat eggs and if they want those chickens to be free range, they ought to be told whether those chickens are free range. We should also be told whether these animals have been fed hormones, growth stimulants, antibiotics, arsenic, all of those. We'd be amazed what goes into the feed that these animals are eating. Now, I want to step back for a minute and pay homage to the vegans in the room, of which I know there are many. One option, obviously, is to boycott completely and not eat these products. I wish there were more of us, and we represent, vegetarians and vegans, about 2% of the population in the United States. We're going to be hearing from David Benzaquin and Josh Tetrick later about the alternatives to meat and eggs. And I think that's really exciting that we are developing viable alternatives. But there's still that 98% of the population that wants to eat meat and eggs and dairy. However, when they're polled, they say, yes, but we want the animals humanely raised and humanely slaughtered. And I think we need to build on that in terms of mandating labeling that's clear and tells the consumer what they're eating, and going after places like Judy's Eggs and other places that are advertising that they are the humane alternative, that, the Foster Farms ads, that they have been certified by the American Humane Association, which is ridiculous because they have some of the cruelest practices around. And so to certify that is egregious. I think we need to really bear down on the advertising, the labeling, and get more honesty in industry.
And if I can add a couple quick things. 2 other points. In thinking about your money, right? So whether or not you're a vegan, you're supporting this with your tax dollars. So your tax dollars subsidize these facilities in so many ways. And so we need to be demanding as taxpayers the information about what our money is funding, and that our money is also funding the whole inspection regime, which is not working very well, and we need to demand that the folks that we're paying to keep watch on this are actually doing it. And we all have some form of sort of standing, if you will, as citizen taxpayers to ask the government to do what they're supposed to do or to stop funding it.
One of the themes that I'm hearing from all of you is this as we talk about the issue of transparency, there's a rhetorical component to everything that's being said. The idea of how is this issue spun, and why do we need more transparency? And I think one can really get a sense of the dimensions of the problem by looking at just asking a simple question: who is the victim here? And if we think about it, especially based on what we've just heard, well, certainly the animals are the victim, no question about that. Then we have we have an enormous amount of environmental degradation, so really everybody is victimized by that. We have antibiotic resistance. Again, this is all of us, regardless of whether we intentionally consume these products. Just drinking water puts us at risk. And then, of course, we have the people who actually work in the industry who are largely ignored and left to be horrifically mistreated and injured. So you can ask who's the victim. You can get a pretty good sense of who they are, except that really who portrays themselves as the victim in these when you read about it, and it is the industrial producers themselves, who like to spin themselves as small family farms who are being oppressed by an overzealous regulatory animal activist legal matrix, which, as Joyce's slides showed you, there are no animal laws, really. So the idea that this would be, that they would be the victims is interesting, and it means that they are controlling the discourse. And so what it comes down to is having to really, asking that question, who is the victim? And then we have to ask, well, who should be taking responsibility for this? And that leads, I think, to the next question I want to ask to the panel, which is, what is the consumer's role in this? If we are indeed all the victims, what should we be doing? And what can the legal system? Why isn't the legal system more responsive? And what can we as consumers do to make it so? What is the role of the consumer? And why don't we start with you, Deb, if you don't mind?
Sure. I know those are very good points that you make, David. And in a sense, we're all the victim, and we're also, in a sense, the perpetrators, because we're consuming and perhaps less educated than we should be about the impacts of our consumption. And I'm interested in exploring the last issue that Joyce talked about, which is this issue of labeling and consumer information, and having consumers aware of really what's going on out there. And it sort of implicates everything, because in order to make consumers aware, we have to have some kind of campaign that really brings these issues to the forefront. And it seems to me, and I'm not a labeling expert, but it seems to me that we don't have an adequate regime in place today to convey information. And I think different consumer labeling efforts and laws over the years have been more or less successful. Often they're co-opted by the folks who want to basically greenwash themselves or whatever the equivalent is in this area. And again, I think that's a place where if these various stakeholders might be able to come together and think about pushing forward a new regime on the labeling side, which is, to me, it's how consumers become aware of the problem ultimately is, what it says on the grocery shelf here. And I just saw a recent study of when you label in supermarkets, it actually has impacts. It was just a very small study on labeling dry cereal products, and labeling it related to the nutrients and health related content of cereal actually had a small but significant difference in terms of consumer buying practices. And you think about that. I mean, if you think about what's the optimistic vision going forward is that we could do something like that on a scale that brought together a lot of these interests who could all agree, even though there might be differences on other things, tactics and ultimate outcomes. That's something that I think, every one of these groups, because they can be labeled for worker impacts and environmental impacts and animal impacts. And so again, because I'm trying to think like, what are things we could do besides just lawyers suing, which we're always doing, but in slow increments. And so that's just an area that I think there have been some models in the past that have worked, and could we all come together and think about that? So.
Yeah, I want to agree that empowering consumers to get information and getting information to consumers was one of the most important things we can do. One of the most interesting parts of working on the antibiotics lawsuit for me was talking to standing witnesses. Something we need when we sue is we have to show a person who is affected by the problem that we're talking about. So we had to line up several people who could say, yeah, I'm affected by the use of antibiotics in livestock production. So I interviewed consumers, and a lot of them didn't know about the problem or didn't understand the problem. They thought the problem was, drugs getting into their meat. They didn't really understand that bacteria were traveling through the public because of this antibiotic use. But some of them did know about the problem, and they were incredibly frustrated by their inability to get information about the meat they were feeding their children. There was a woman whose child had leukemia, and he had a depressed immune system. So she was really, really concerned about, giving him safe food. But at the same time, he's a 6-year-old, and he wants to eat chicken nuggets with his friends, and she didn't want to control his, dietary choices too much. But she felt she was in this uncomfortable position where she always had to be trying to ask about, where did this meat come from? Is it antibiotic free? And she couldn't get that information a lot of the time. I think the labeling is important, but again, a lot of the labels that are out there are opaque, and it's hard to tell what they actually mean. One of the things we've been doing at NRDC is, telling people which labels we've investigated actually stand for no use of non-therapeutic antibiotics. But I agree that's something we could get together on and find labels or create labels that meet the needs of our different constituencies, so that we could push a label that we felt good about on all of these different metrics, and not just, antibiotic-free, but also animal welfare and environmental concerns. That's something I'd love to see us work on together. I do think, too, that consumers have been energized by some of the legal successes we've had. One of the unexpected outcomes of the case was seeing a ton of media coverage that really publicized this problem and got people interested in it. So I hope we can continue to build on that and move beyond the legal realm and get people interested in making this change, because I think that's where the change really needs to come from.
I'd like to build on something that Debbie said, which is that, as lawyers, we are so focused on the lawsuits. I'll be the first to admit that I really don't understand much about communications, and I'm just not that good at it. And so it's wonderful when we bring people into our organizations who do understand communications, and we'll build on that. And an example I like to give, and I don't see Lisa in the room, but I love, where is she? Okay. Lisa. Our communications director is Lisa Franzetta, and a few years ago, the lawyers were focused on a lawsuit that we brought against a company called Cork Pork. Love that name, Cork Pork. And Cork Pork was keeping their sows in gestation crates, which are abysmal, as I earlier described. And so we filed our lawsuit against Cork Pork, and we had all of our legal theories, violation of California Penal Code 597T, which says that if you confine an animal, the animal has to be given room to exercise. Obviously, gestation crates don't give any room to exercise. And then also violation of unfair business laws in California. So we were off and running with our legal theories. At the same time, Lisa was sitting in front of her computer, and she noticed that there's something called Dodger dogs, and they're very popular. They're hot dogs that are sold at Dodger Stadium. Well, those hot dogs are made from the piglets who come from the sows at Cork Pork. And so Lisa said, okay, let's make that connection and feed it to the media and see what we get. The media picked up on it. Fox News called us. I ran down to San Francisco and did an interview on top of a building. And the next thing we saw within a couple of days was a Fox News report which showed talking about the gestation crates, and they had this marvelous visual of a gestation crate next to a hot dog. We had written a letter to the president of the Dodgers saying, please do not carry these Dodger dogs anymore because they are the product of animals who have been cruelly confined. And of course, the president of Dodger Stadium, or the Dodgers, didn't give us what we wanted, but what we wanted was media exposure of gestation crates and pigs and hot dogs. We wanted the public to make that connection. A couple of weeks after that, I was in Texas speaking to a group of lawyers, and someone came up to me and said that 2 weeks earlier, she had been in Guatemala, and she had seen the Fox News report with the gestation crates next to the hot dogs. So the lawsuit did what it was going to do. We were able to close down Cork Pork, but the media approach and our communications directors, I think, brilliant approach went a lot further than that lawsuit would have. One other thing I just want to say quickly is I think we do need to keep in touch with members of industry. We've invited, or Cal's invited, Dennis Treacy of Smithfield, the largest pork producer in the United States, last year to speak at the conference at Lewis and Clark. Building on that, I invited him to speak to my students when I was teaching farmed animal law in May at John Marshall. And we talked, and he said, we've committed to phasing out gestation crates. That is all consumer driven. We would not be doing it but for the fact that the consumers are pushing us to do this. It's costing multiple millions of dollars, but we are doing it, and we're finding it's working, and so we're going to speed up the process. But it started with the consumers.
And I think that's a really good bridge to what I like to say, which is that it's useful to step back and think about how we got here. Because when we have this conversation here this morning, it's hard not to get outraged, right, at what's going on and how many problems there are. It's also sometimes hard not to get overwhelmed. But if we understand a little bit better how we got here, I think we can have more effective conversations with all the stakeholders and help them understand the framework. And this sort of goes to David's framing of who's the victim here. So on the outrage side, right, there was a bill, there was proposed regulations for OSHA last year to protect young farm workers from things that are put them at risk of death, okay? And so it was rolling along the regulatory process, and all of a sudden the Farm Bureau and the farm industry said, no, you can't do this to us. You can't do this to us. This is awful. We don't want this. And they got up in arms. And frankly, we're talking about OSHA and USDA, right? These are farmer-friendly folk. They thought they were helping. They thought they were protecting people so they could continue to work in these environments, and they did not expect the backlash they got. And the farmers killed the regs, right? They're gone. So these were only protecting underage people, right, who work in the farms. But people said, no, we got it under control. We're okay with how things are. So that creates the outrage. So how did we get to that position? And how is it that we have this trouble communicating with consumers so that they know what the current realities are? Well, I think part of it is that our history of farming in the United States and sort of around the world is that these are wonderful people who provide food for our tables, right? In clean and healthy environments. There's nothing more American, right, than the good old red barn out there, right? And they're doing it for us. Well, that sort of used to be true. And it's really important to think about the structural consequences of that kind of a system, because it meant that those farmers couldn't afford to lose very many pigs or cows, right, to disease or predation. So they took good care of them. They couldn't afford to lose soil because they needed those crops to feed their families and to feed the animals. So they took better care of the water and of the soil. Now, those kind of folks don't own these facilities. And what we have is, well, we don't mind losing a certain number of pigs because if we have a certain higher number, we're going to offset it and we'll have some, economies of that will make it reasonable that these losses are just business losses, right? They're like widgets now, right? So the soil and the water and the animals themselves, as well as the workers, are commodified in ways they didn't used to be commodified. But people don't know that. Right? When they think of farm, I don't always say farm. I've been saying farm a lot today because farm really connotes, it conjures up this image that is no longer true. And that's one of the reasons we have such a disconnect when we're trying to get these messages across. Because why would a farmer do that? Why would a farmer put their child at risk? Well, if it's a Guatemalan child, right, that doesn't belong to this community, you can understand why that child might be more vulnerable, right? Why would they put the soil at risk? Because once they use it up, they can go buy more land and set up a CAFO someplace else. They don't have the attachments or the commitments to these built-in sort of security mechanisms that we assume. And once we understand that, we can understand, okay, if this is just a business model, then we can talk to you like business people, right? And that takes the emotional content down a little bit, and we can have conversations with the folks at Smith Hill and say, then let me tell you the economic harm once this information does get out, right? I can have that conversation with you. But we need to understand which conversations we're having with people in which context, and then we'll be more effective.
Okay, so that concludes our lightning round. And now we want to open up the discussion to you folks. So questions you might have. And I would ask you, those of you who do want to pose questions to the panel, please go up to the microphone so that everybody can hear the question, and then we can address it. Microphone.
Hi, my name is Fiona. I'm a student at Columbia Law School. And so I think part of the theme of this panel is really, the underlying theme is the strength of the agriculture industry lobby. And really how much access they have to the legislature and the regulators that we don't have because, when we take these consumer grassroots activism that does have effects, but is often countered, as you mentioned, by their strength. And I wondered if any of you have any ideas about how we can increase our direct access to members of the legislature and actually increase the power of our lobby in that way.
There are a number of strategies. There are a number of grassroots organizations. One of the other things that Deb had mentioned is going in partnership with others. So we at the clinic at Lewis and Clark, we actually do work with small farmers, because even when we get access to the legislature or the legislators, they're going to hear what I have to say very differently than how they're going to hear it if it comes from a small farmer saying, this is unfair business competition, or they're polluting my soil and it's hurting my farm. And it's a very different conversation. So access, I think, is really important. So there are a number of groups. There are a number of points of access, though, to think about as well, right? So the USDA, for instance, the USDA's mission is to protect and promote agriculture, okay? And they're also the enforcement mechanism. So the FAA decided that was a conflict of interest a while ago and separated out those functions. We haven't done that for the USDA or any of the state ag departments. So they're both promoters and boosters and enforcers, and that doesn't work. So letting people understand that. So for instance, the USDA is promoting dairy, and so they spent $6 million, right, trying to help Domino's figure out like the cheese crust pizza and things like that. They came up with that, okay? Domino's didn't come up with that. At the same time, another part of the USDA is trying to deal with diabetes and with obesity and stuff like that caused by the food we're feeding ourselves, right? So trying to get people to figure out which conversation you want to have with which people and who do you want to be on your side and what information do you have. So access is always going to be a problem because, frankly, in my view, USDA has been captured by the industry, and as long as that's true, we're going to have an uphill battle. But there are outside places, and I think as others have suggested, sometimes more powerful because the legislators respond to consumer interest when it becomes overwhelming and they can't ignore it anymore.
And I would just add to that there's no question the farm lobby and the industrial farming lobby is extremely powerful in places like here in California and the Midwest and the South. But if you find the right combination of folks, as Kathy was saying, you can also think about state legislatures as an opportunity. I know in California here and in at least some other states, you can get things on the legislative agenda pretty easily. You can get someone to sponsor a hearing but what you need is the right constituent of folks to come out and express their concerns. So that's the small farms and the local community folks who are being impacted. And again, it might not be the Guatemalan, but it's the local homes down the street that live with a constant odor and irritation. So it takes a lot of work, but I think don't forget, so the agencies are one venue, but are often, especially at the state level, are often captured agencies. So trying to get to the legislatures where it matters to them in terms of their constituents coming out, and that's actually pretty easy to do, to sort of try to ramp up stuff in committee hearings and stuff. And again, they serve then as a vehicle for a broader media campaign because you take that stuff kind of on the road.
Hi, my name is Jillian. Sorry, that was really loud. My name is Jillian. I'm from UC Irvine School of Law. I'm a student there. And I guess my question actually kind of goes off of Fiona's question, and I really appreciate your answer where we have to motivate the legislature and show that their constituents have a passion for this issue. But a problem I see with this area of law, a hurdle that we face, is that it seems a very coastal issue where, I'm sure a lot of us are from more urban or more academic environments. How do we get the people in, the rest of the country who might struggle with putting, unethical eggs on the table rather than free-range eggs? How do we instill a passion or an interest in this area of law so that we can motivate the legislator to respond to the constituents,
I get the sense that you're talking about keeping the cost of these products low for people who, and one of the things that we just touched on a little bit is that CAFOs appear to be economically viable and a preferred way of raising these animals more effectively, efficiently, and keeping costs down. What we don't realize is that they are so heavily subsidized in so many ways that it's quite illusory. And if we were to change, and this is a big order, we have to change our public policy about what we subsidize and what we don't subsidize. For a long time, we were subsidizing grains such as corn and soybean, and that's 50% of the cost of raising animals is what they are fed in intensive confinement. If we do, and that's less now than it was. I mean, corn and soybean producers were selling those products, those grains, to intensive confinement facilities at a price that was less than what it cost them to produce it, and then the government was subsidizing them. That's become less of an issue, but in terms of pollution, if we were to require the CAFOs to bear a more just and fair load of the pollution that they are causing, instead of allowing them to shift that to the taxpayers, to us, the price of that meat would have to go up. And it would be possible, and it is possible, for smaller producers to compete financially with the CAFOs if we change our policy and reward more humane practices, put the cost of cleanup on the backs of those who are producing the waste in the first place. And there are other things that we could be doing that would create a shift back to less intensive confinement and frankly doing away with intensive confinement, which would have an effect of lessening all of these other problems that we're talking about here.
And I'll just say really quickly, having talked to rural farmers and rural folks who live near CAFOs in the Midwest and around the country, they're pissed off, right? These are people who care about the land, they care about the community, and they feel that their trust has been violated. They feel like there was a farming code, right, and that they've followed it, but these CAFOs haven't. And they're the ones bearing really direct impacts, financial, health, all kinds of things. So when you talk to them, one of the things that's been stunning to me is no one's talking to them. Their voices aren't getting out. And it used to be, 10 years ago, they weren't really willing to talk, right? There was sort of this farm code. You didn't ever say anything bad about a farmer, especially when you're from the farming community. That's changing. And people want to feed their kids healthy food, right? So there is privilege for sure in the academy and on the coast and in urban areas, but and we should note that privilege. And I feel like we have more of a responsibility, right, than to take this burden on. But talking to those people, asking them what they want us to do to help them, not deciding for them, right, what the next strategy is. There's an awful lot of energy and it's growing. And so I'm actually really hopeful for lots of parts of the country for people to take this on.
Just really quickly, one of the things we've done is promote rural farmers who are doing things better. There's a hog farmer in Missouri, Russ Kramer, who used to raise hogs in the traditional industrial way, but he was gored by one of his hogs and contracted a serious antibiotic-resistant infection and almost died. And he saw the light and he changed his practices. He started over and he now has a free-range pig farm in Missouri where he doesn't give antibiotics to his pigs. He treats them well. NRDC gave him an award and gave him a platform to tell his story nationally, and he's been getting a lot of press coverage. And we need to keep promoting people like that who are doing things better rather than always just hammering on people who are doing things wrong.
So if I also just might say one thing about that, I think about that kind of question a lot, and the way I can conceive of the issue, I say look to the veal, because veal, people across the country have a very visceral reaction to veal. People who are omnivorous to the nth degree won't eat veal because they are aware of how the calves are treated, and they simply find that to be ethically reprehensible. And I find that to be sociologically fascinating. I mean, I think it's great, but it's also fascinating that those people who are they just draw a line in the sand with respect to veal calves don't also react to a sow being strapped in what's called a rape rack and forcibly impregnated over and over again until she is spent and then slaughtered. It seems to me that there are the same kinds of things that would make people just draw back in dismay with any animal, but veal somehow has successfully entered the consciousness of the American consumer, and I'm not sure why, and I think if we could figure out why, it would be enormously helpful in raising consciousness about other animal issues.
I'm Jeff. I work at ALDF. And Debbie, you mentioned some of the common law solutions to trying to regulate CAFOs. My supervisor asked me to tell him whether and how we could use the public trust doctrine to regulate air emissions at CAFOs. And every day that I don't get him an answer, he becomes increasingly impatient. So what should I tell him?
Oh, well, yes, the easy questions. So for sure that the public trust has come back into the consciousness of lawyers working on these issues and environmental issues more generally, and there is now a growing scholarly literature on how to use these doctrines, but nuisance and trespass, but particularly the public trust, to try to attack some of these problems. And it really is about expanding the doctrine from its core history, and when you take it to sort of air impacts and of course, there's someone who's writing a lot about this at the University of Oregon. Professor Mary Wood is trying to really promote the public trust doctrine across the states. It's a state law doctrine. There really isn't a really robust federal law public trust approach. So my advice on this is people need to find those instances that have a good set of facts and push it in the courts. And I think one of the things, I teach law students, and one of the things I find is that students sometimes say, well, there's no case law that says we can do that, right? And then I always talk about the civil rights movement and, what was the case law that said they could do that? But I do think there is actually a concerted effort, and one of the things is lawyers talking across the states and across areas about what's worked and what hasn't worked. But obviously it's a sympathetic, because your plaintiffs are the local communities impacted here. So it's not so much the big groups, but those are the things that are most sympathetic to the local courts that will hear these things. And so I encourage people to pick out cases that have good facts and start to build some of that. And you're likely to lose some of them. But again, it's a vehicle for getting the issue out there. And it's also a vehicle for finding the right case. And I think in the common law area, what happens is, once in a while you get a court to say, yeah, that's right, and then you build momentum, and so it's definitely it's a thing that I think across the board environmental lawyers are looking at. Let's go back and look at these common law doctrine, and there's not the right to farm stuff perhaps comes in the way, and so it's tricky, right? And you got to look at it at the state level, but I think there are certain ways around it, and there might be some places that are better to do it than others.
Hi, I think this is partially a question and partially an observation. Last year at the conference in Portland, Oregon, we had a panel on the sustainability of meat. And I know that I think I was one of 4 people in the room that actually ate meat. And so I went home, and that Thanksgiving, I actually did buy a Smithfield ham because they don't use gestation crates. And what I've come to find out when I speak with people that are interested is my friends that were vegetarian, vegan, if you ask them, well, what meat should I buy? They didn't have an answer because they didn't know which companies were using what practices. And so I think the question is, are we doing a disservice by not knowing the answer to that question so that people that want to know what can I do on my budget because I can't afford to eat organic or certified, where are, I don't know what the answer is, or if should be a way that we can address this, but 98% of the population does still eat meat, so.
Yeah, that's something that a number of folks are working on, and it's a good point. It's complicated by a number of factors. So one, I would just say that Smithfield is working to phase out the crates. They're not there yet. So that's just a quick example, right, of the information that we have and trying to get accurate information. The other thing that's difficult is a lot of folks who are labeling, as Joyce said, one way or another, are mislabeling. And so they're actually charging consumers more for products that don't have the value the consumers are looking for. So labeling is something that I think all of us, or almost all of us, are working on so that the information is actually accurate. One difficulty with that is that once someone gets a label or gets a certification, then usually the compliance, inspections are every 3 years or something like that, and so they don't necessarily follow up. And so there's lots of horror stories about misleading information. But there are a lot of, and the other thing that's really important is the more information that you can get access to is going to be with the local small producers. You just can't get access to the truth, right, to actual information from the large industrial producers. So this is a sort of city by town problem, but more and more people have buying clubs and have websites, and usually the local farmers are some of the best ones to talk to in a community. So if you tell me where you live, I can maybe hook you up.
Hi, thank you all so much. My name is David Benzigan. I work in marketing, so it's unrelated somewhat, but I'll be speaking later. My question is about how we can tie your work and your experiences to another very large issue, aquaculture. I'm very interested in the fact that there are tens of billions of animals in addition to the 9 or 10 billion land animals that are suffering every year for food that we can't count really in the seas. And I'm particularly interested as we move to more industrialized aquaculture, how we're using antibiotics, how we're crowding, how we're confining, and how we might think of the lessons we've learned so far in our very important work on farm animals to apply there.
And just before I let the panel answer, let me just let you all know that we are unfortunately about to run out of time. So this will be the last question.
Thank you, David, for that. I really appreciate it because I usually try to mention aquaculture in all of my presentations because people don't think about it, and I just didn't have time, so I cut a few things out of my presentation. So aquaculture is a really important thing, and so just as poultry are not included in most of our legal regulations, the few that we actually have, they're explicitly usually exempted. Aquaculture is not even mentioned, right? So the regulations that we have do not apply to aquaculture. The OSHA statistics do not apply to workers in aquaculture settings. It's ridiculous. And so we need to think a lot about and aquaculture being two things, right? So the fish that are being raised to feed other animals, fish and other animals, as well as the fish that are being raised for human consumption. The industry is getting really large. Luckily, it's worse in Asia, I suppose, than it is for us, but we're getting there. And this is something that anyone can get in. If you want to be in the ground floor and if you want to make a difference, this is an area you all can make a difference. Write letters, letters to the editor, write to your legislators, find out information. Aquaculture, there are more animals affected in aquaculture than these other areas, and we're just not spending enough time on it. But I think quick answers, all the lessons that we've been talking about apply exactly.
Yeah, there's also huge antibiotic abuse in aquaculture, and a lot of our seafood is imported, and it's even worse. There's a feed additive, an antibiotic that's banned in the U.S. as a feed additive, nitrofurazone, because it's a carcinogen. It's used in producing shrimp in Asia, and those shrimp come to the U.S., and we've found residues of this carcinogenic antibiotic in shrimp that goes to U.S. to tables. So that's a looming issue that we're going to be looking into too. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I would just say that environmental issues, there are a lot of parallels on the environmental issues for aquaculture. There are some here at Stanford who are trying to work on more sustainable aquaculture, and so it's a new area, and I don't know that much about it, but there are people trying to deal with given the demand for fish protein around the world, there are folks who are trying to work on methods that are more sustainable.
And just by way of tying a bow on that and getting back to the whole issue of who's the victim, one of the things rhetorically that I think is very interesting with respect to aquaculture and fishing in general is probably just about everybody in this room was raised to believe that fish don't feel pain. And that there is absolutely no scientific basis for that, none whatsoever. And if you think about it, again, of course they feel pain. But this is the line we've been fed, and we've swallowed it. But that's a discussion for to be continued. And please join me in thanking the panel for an outstanding.